Working Cows Podcast, episode 179.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network. And this morning, I wanted to let you know that one of our favorite ag podcasts, Fieldwork, is back for an all-new season. Co-hosts Mitchell Hora and Zach Johnson are back to talk all things sustainable ag. This season, they'll tackle farm financing innovation, carbon markets, new sustainability standards in crops like cotton, and so much more. They're also doing a special focus on Washington County, Iowa, where Mitchell lives and farms, which has a very strong conservation culture. What's the special sauce, you ask? Well, tune in and find out. Episodes drop weekly on Wednesdays. You can find them at fieldworktalk.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Very excited today to be joined by Dallas Mount. Of course, he is the CEO of Ranch Management Consultants, the folks who put on the Ranching for Profit School and the Executive Link program. And I invited him in here today to talk about a new topic for Dallas on the podcast anyways, and that is the grazing principles that are taught in the Ranching for Profit School. So Dallas, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
You're welcome, Clay. Glad to be here.
I have often had you on, and we've ended up talking about people issues, and that's obviously an important thing, and we don't want to neglect that, but I figured sometime when we have you on, we'll talk about something other than people, so I invited you on today to talk about the grazing principles. Some of my aha moments during the Ranching for Profit School centered around these 5 grazing principles, and so I guess what I'd like to do is give you an opportunity to kind of outline those grazing principles, and then we'll go back through and talk to each one of them specifically about kind of what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to protect against it with each of those grazing principles.
Sure. Yeah. So I like the word that you've been using, principles. I think that's an important distinction. Oftentimes, people want to dive right into talking about practices. Right. And I think that there's a big distinction between principles and practice. Right. So principles, let's let those be our truths, the things that our decisions are based on, and then how we apply those principles in our environment and with our skills and our goals will be our practices. Right. And I think it's an important distinction to make, because oftentimes people always want to just dive into, well, how long are you going to graze that pasture for? Well, what's your rest period going to be there? Or how many cows are you going to run on this ranch? Right. And those are your practices. But the principles should guide those. So yeah, I think we're ready to dive in.
Yeah. So just on that note, a little bit, maybe fleshing that out a little bit, would you say principles work everywhere, practices change depending on, location, environment, whatever, goals, those things?
Yes, the principles are going to be universal. They're going to work in all environments. I had the fortune to travel to Australia a few years ago, and they talk about similar grazing principles there. So they're going to work in all environments. Whether you're desert country or whether you're 60-inch rainfall, the principles are going to hold true. Now, how you apply those principles is going to look very different in the red desert of Wyoming than it looks on the south coast of Texas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So where do we start? What's principle number 1, so to speak?
All right. So principle number 1, and there's a reason it's number 1, and that is rest period. And the principle is rest period depends on the rate of growth. Now, there's probably some grazing, people that hold they're particular on the way these are worded that are saying rest period's the wrong word to use. It's recovery period, and they're right. So recovery means when plants are actively growing. So the recovery period is going to depend on the rate of growth.
So I grazed that pasture all summer and rested all winter. That's not exactly what you're talking about.
You got it. Yeah, we gotta have meaningful recovery to actually have what I often slip up and call rest.
Sure.
So.
Gotcha. What does success look like with recovery period? How are people who are managing this principle well handling it? And I know that's going to look different everywhere, but if you could give me a couple of examples, that would be helpful, I think.
Yeah. So I'm going to say the most important thing is to get the recovery period right. Now that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Okay. And I don't think in my lifetime, I'll ever feel like I have this figured out. I think people who are good at grazing are going to have different discussions about what having the recovery period right looks like on their place. I think when you're turning animals in and you're going, oh man, I just wish this pasture had another 2 or 3 weeks to have good recovery before I was coming in. Then you're getting it wrong. When you're turning animals in and you think, these plants are just way too mature, my animal performance is going to be terrible, then we've got the recovery period wrong. So your climate is going to dictate some onto which of those you're focused on. If you're in a drier area where the plants never get very tall, having long recoveries, you could almost not have too long a recovery period in those areas. I mean, yeah, you take it out to multiple years, and those plants need to be grazed. But if you're talking 6-inch precip zone, if that pasture's rested for 2 years, recovery period or animal performance might still be very good grazing that. If we're talking high rainfall environments, if you get to, in some cases, even a 30-day recovery period, that's going to be too long. And animal performance is going to suffer because of it, because those plants are all going to get ahead of you. So the principle is get the recovery period right. The recovery period is never going to be the same. It's going to depend on the rate of growth. But you start paying attention and you start looking down, looking into the soil, looking at the animals, and you're going to start to build your skill set as a good grazer. And there'll be times when you think, yeah, got it right there, and just learn from those lessons. But I don't think any of us are ever going to feel like we have all the answers to this.
In the big picture, what are we trying to protect against when it comes to recovery period?
Overgrazing. So overgrazing is a function of time, right? And that's a big distinction. Most of your neighbors think that overgrazing is a function of the number of animals in a pasture, right? If you run into your neighbor at the coffee shop, he might tell you, well, we never overgraze, right? And what he's trying to say is we don't put more animals in that pasture than it will sustain. Okay? Well, if you start saying, well, how long were you in that pasture? Well, we were in there for 60 days this year. And part of that was during the period of rapid growth. Well, you bet your bottom dollar that some plants were grazed, started to recover, and were regrazed, started to recover, and were regrazed. And that's overgrazing, right? So overgrazing is a function of time. It's not a function of numbers. And you can graze a pasture 2 ways. You can come back too soon, or you can stay too long. Right? And both of those are a function of time. So when we get recovery periods right, we're protecting against overgrazing. And by doing that, we're building health of those plants, building vigor, hopefully increasing biodiversity, and hopefully building soil.
Very good. We've got 4 more principles to get through, and I've got a couple of voicemails I want to share with you that people called in and left, and so I think we're gonna keep moving unless there's something major under the heading of recovery period that we need to hit.
I think that's great, but it is the first principle, and it's the one that is so often violated. So I'm okay to spend a little more time on there, and I'll tighten it up on these other ones.
No, we don't have to do that. I just, I can see where we're headed here, so.
All right.
Next grazing principle. What is it in your mind?
Matching stocking rate and carrying capacity. That would I think be the second one. So that's about matching supply and demand. Okay. So when we think of carrying capacity, think of that from the ground up, right? So that's building capacity of the land to support animals. So that's how much forage are you going to grow? Okay. And then stocking rate, think of that as from the animal down, right? So that's the demand on the pasture. So supply and demand, the principle is match them. Okay. So stocking rate and carrying capacity, let's match them.
Sure. So maybe in the recovery period, we're talking about building that below ground biomass. And in the stocking rate, we're talking about protecting or building that above ground biomass. We're protecting the roots with recovery period, and we are harvesting efficiently that above ground biomass with stocking rate. Is that a good way to think about it?
Maybe. I guess when I think about it from below and from above, I'm thinking about supply.
Right.
How much are we growing? And then I'm thinking about demand, the mouths that are you chewing that, right? So that's kind of where I think about matching supply and demand. One's from the bottom up, one's from the top down.
What are some of the keys in succeeding at this? I mean, what are some of the tools at our dispense to make sure that we are matching stocking rate and carrying capacity? Because, every year is different. Every time I say this to somebody else, I get a chuckle. It's Brian Alexander. It's original to Brian Alexander. Normal's just a setting on a dryer. So, there is no normal year. And so, how are people succeeding at matching stocking rate to carrying capacity?
Yeah, I love it that you worked a Brian Alexander quote in here. He's got some good ones. So carrying capacity is going to change seasonally and annually, and those variations are going to be different in different climates. Okay, so let's think of a ranch that runs entirely on irrigated pastures under center pivots that have very dependable wells. Right. So there might not be very much fluctuation in terms of annual carrying capacity. Okay. Those places might always produce, 12 cow months per acre or whatever it might be. Right. So, but then let's take a ranch that's all rangeland and it's all rain fed. So it just depends on what comes down from the sky. And it's in a climate that experiences extremely high variations in rainfall. Right. So probably when I was in Australia is when I got to see the greatest variation of this. And I got to spend time with Jim Lindsay out on his property. And at one time they were running 6,000 and 7,000 head on the place. And when I was out there, they were in year 6 of a drought and they destocked to 400 head. And so think about that. I mean, that's less than 10% of the capacity that it once was. Okay, so that'd be like a ranch that was running 400 cows, running 40, right? So I mean, there's some enormous variations in that climate. So you got to match these things seasonally and annually. And the way to operationalize this is to have the enterprise mix match the fluctuation. So if if you always have very dependable feed and you want to stock that ranch up with cows that you love, will knock yourself out. But for most of us that have variation in these things, then we can't be stocked up to our gills with cows that we're emotionally unwilling to get rid of in those dry years. It's gonna cripple you. So have a good mix of enterprises. So maybe it is a base cow herd if that works for you and meets your goals, but that base cow herd should only be stocked to a portion of the ranch's carrying capacity. And I would suggest that portion is probably going to be 50% or less of that ranch's carrying capacity with these cows that you love. Right. And then the other remainder of that can be more flexible enterprises. Now I think there's some people that would argue really well that all of your enterprises should be very flexible. And when we start saying, well, I can't sell these animals, well, we've really crippled our management. Every animal on your place should be for sale every day of the year if you're ranching for profit. Right.
Especially in 2014.
Yeah.
That's a huge opportunity when things like that happen to, cash out, realize some equity and maybe get back in later when things aren't as good as they are or as they were. I mean, the hit in economic value that most ranches took between 2014 and 2016, if they were having to actually write a check for that cow depreciation, most of them would have gone belly up. So
yeah, that's absolutely right. And we can take a little segue here on that, but I won't do it. That might be a segment for another time. Because who knows when it's high and when it's low, right? When you're in the moment, right? When you're in the moment, you don't know. So we can look back on it now and say, well, golly, we should have done that. But at the time, it was like, well, man, look how high they are. They might go higher. Right.
Yep, absolutely. No, I mean, we are recording this on the heels of the GameStop deal, where some guys saw that one particular stock was over shorted, and they got in and drove the price from $3 to $400. And the screenshots I saw would indicate to me that one guy at least made $6 million if he rode that up to 400 and got out. But now it's back down to 50. And I mean, this was all in the matter of like 2 or 3 weeks that this happened. Went from $3 to $400 back to 50. So I mean, there was a lot of money made and lost on both sides of that issue, and nobody knows. So it's kind of, are you making money? Can you make money at this amount? Are you comfortable cashing out now? Maybe it's time. If not, then maybe it's time to think about a different strategy. But nobody knows.
Yeah.
So, I think one of the tools that we talked about for this is kind of that A, B, and C herd idea. Is that a part of how we go about matching stocking rate to carrying capacity, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's one way to do it. And I like that strategy, right? So we've got a base herd that has a high gross margin that, is maybe part of the reason why we ranch is we enjoy running these types of animals, right? I think that's fine. But I do think you need to be able to ramp things up in good years and then quickly ramp them down in bad years. So at least a portion of the animals that you're carrying on your ranch should allow you the flexibility of doing that. Now, if you're ranching for profit, it comes back to gross margin, right? Let's let gross margin tell us which of those animals are going to be our base herd to keep, and rather than our emotional attachment to them, right?
Yeah. What are the tools kind of at our disposal as far as determining when it's time to destock, and how do we go about making those decisions?
Yeah, I'm sure this has probably been covered on your podcast before, but having some pre-established dates that are we call them critical rain dates, right, or critical dates to look at the situation. So maybe it's not a long list of dates. It's probably going to be 2 or 3 for most ranches, right? Of times when you really go out and you do an assessment of where we are. And that's important because it's going to hold you accountable to that, right? These things should be on a calendar. You should have somebody that you're reporting to on this assessment. And then next to those dates are the decisions that you're going to make. Okay, so here's our dates. Here's what we think our carrying capacity is going to be this year. And so now we're going to make those decisions about what kind of adjustments we're going to make. It's almost always easier to make those. It's almost always better to make those decisions early rather than wait and be too late behind them. I mean, Bud Williams was the one that talked about the 3 inventories that a rancher is managing: grass, money, and livestock. And you think about that in a destocking situation, you're going to convert livestock to grass and to money. Right. So I'm destocking my ranch. So I'm going to build grass and I'm going to put money in my pocket if I'm selling them, if I own those animals. Okay. And in a drought situation, you will not go broke having too much money in your bank and too much grass in your paddock. Right? That grass in your paddock is going to become extremely valuable, especially if the drought worsens. Right. So you're not going to go broke making these decisions to destock. And then putting yourself in a position of power. I mean, think how much power you have if you're the person in the drought that has money in the bank and grass in front of you. That's a great place to be. Everybody else is going to hold on to those animals until they're out of options, and then they're out of money, and then they're being pushed back on their heels, right? And that's the position they're trying to make their decision in. So make the decisions early. If it starts raining, don't look back. Just push forward.
Yep. And one of our major motivations in attending the Ranching for Profit School was to get the tools to develop that drought plan. And one of the things that I found that helped with that was a government website that gives you county by county rain or precip data. I think it's every month of the year since 1901. And so I put that in the show notes page of Working Cows episode 173. I will put it also in the show notes page for here. It's going to be workingcows.net/179 is the show notes page for today. And there will be a link to that county by county rainfall data. When I download, you have to download the whole state. And so when I downloaded South Dakota state, it was 70,000 lines of data. And I deleted it back down to just the last 5 years for Meade County, which is where I live. And so that gives me a good kind of framework of over the last 5 or 10 years, whatever I kept. These are the dates, and so does that decision look like if we don't have rain by this date, this percentage of our stocking rate is going to go back to whatever, going to go to the sale barn, going to go back to the person whose custom cattle they are, whatever that is. Is it kind of by this date we have this much, or we are going to send this percentage away?
It certainly can look like that. And I like that because it provides quantifiable, objective decision criteria. But as you think about what grows grass, it's not just an actual number of how much rain we got, right? There's going to be other things that play into it. When did the rain come? How did it come? Temperatures, all those things. So I'm okay if somebody wants to say, okay, we're going to go out and do a forage assessment, right? And we're going to write down the number of how many stock days per acre do we have in front of us, right? We're going to dig some holes and do some soil moisture assessments. We're going to look at short-term forecast. I don't put much faith in the long-term forecast, but if you wanted to say, hey, we're going to look at a 10-day forecast and see what's likely in terms of moisture, and then we're going to use this numbers that you're having, and we're going to bring all those things together and make a decision. What you don't want to end up with is putting yourself in we're going to wait and see. And we'll come back and revisit this another 3 weeks from now and see what we're thinking then, right? And because then you're going to just give yourself excuses.
Sure, very good. Should we move on?
Let's move on.
Okay, next one up, as I have it in my notes, is stock density, and the hash mark behind that is the higher the better. Is that the next one in your mind, or is there something else that you would put?
No, let's go there. Let's go there. I like it. So stock density, the principle is the higher the better for the plants and the soil. Okay? So think about this. Higher the stock density. Let's define stock density first. Most of the time people talk about the stock density in terms of pounds per acre. Okay, how many pounds am I putting on a certain acre? And that's fine. I think it might actually be more meaningful to talk about in terms of mouths per acre, because it's really hooves and mouths are what's doing it rather than the actual physical weight of the animal. But pounds per acre is fine. So from a plant and a soil perspective, you really can't get stock densities too high. Right. I mean, that plant and that soil would rather have a whole lot of animals for just an instant and then they're gone than to have very few animals that are there for a long period of time. Okay, so and there's some studies of things that aren't really practical things, but where they've actually just taken a hot wire and all that could be there is mouths and hooves, right? And they're moving this hot wire inches forward at a time. And so stock densities are, in the millions of pounds per acre. And from a plant and a soil perspective, that's wonderful. Now you can get to a point from an animal perspective where you're going to create stress. And it's going to be all based in, stockmanship and what your animals are used to. You think about taking a bunch of people that are used to living out in Wyoming and South Dakota rangeland and shoving them in a subway car, right? There's going to be a lot of stress. But for some people, that's their normal life, right? So they're used to that. So animals can be the same way. You can have animals that this would be extremely stressful for, or animals that could be used to this. So stock density, it's really one of our tools to create successional change in these plant communities and to build soil, is to get that stock density high. And I think there's practical barriers on this. and it just, now maybe I'd like to be proven wrong, but I haven't seen where you can afford to put the infrastructure development in place in really low rainfall environments to get stock densities really high. If somebody else is paying for it, you probably can. But if you're trying to pay for it with animals, it's going to be pretty hard. So generally in higher rainfall environments or irrigated pastures, or where we see people really able to push this because you can afford to put the infrastructure in to allow you to do it.
And I guess on the first one during recovery period, I asked you, what are we trying to protect against here? And I mean, on some level, the answer to all of those could be overgrazing, right? I mean, every one of these principles, what are we trying to protect against, except for maybe the last one? What are we trying to protect against? The answer could be overgrazing, but is there something else going on here in your mind?
So there's a few things going on when you increase stock densities. We're going to increase the uniformity of use in a pasture. So, just take in your mind a one section pasture that you're going to put 100 cows in for a grazing season, right? And then let's take that section pasture and let's divide it into 8 equal portions, right? And put those same 100 cows in there, but now they're in each of those for shorter periods of time. Right. So the stock density just went up 8-fold by doing that. Now, what's the grazing going to look like? Well, we're going to increase uniformity of use. So we're going to push that grazing pressure out away from the water point into maybe some of those less preferred areas that'll see more even grazing pressure. So we're actually going to pick up some cow days just by doing that. Right. Get some more grazing on those plants that they otherwise would have avoided, push some of that grazing pressure out to those less desirable areas. So it's going to allow us to increase stocking rate. We're also the rest of those plants is going to go up 8-fold, right? I mean, they're going to get a lot more rest because now instead of being in there for 5-6 months, those animals are going to be in there for a much shorter period of time. So the rest, the meaningful rest recovery of those pastures is going to go up. So stock density is a tool, really a tool to create that successional change, to start building soil. It's a tool that uses energy that's internal to the system. So we're not spending money on fertilizer and on mechanical treatments and on all these things. We're using nature's toolbox to do this for us. Doesn't mean it's free. You got to put in some water and fence usually, or combining herds is probably the best way to do it initially.
Mm-hmm. I think that in the book, so I'm obviously a professional. Today I forgot my laptop at home, so I'm borrowing the church's laptop. My phone just rang during the episode, and I had my Ranching for Profit notebook sitting on the table to bring with me. I forgot that too. But I think in the textbook it says stock density, use the highest stock density practical. Is that right?
Yeah, part of it is using the largest herd possible with good animal husbandry, and that has some overlap with another one that we're going to. But for most people, the best way to build stock density quickly is looking at combining herds before we start building paddocks. And oftentimes that comes back to spending some money on water so we can support a larger herd. Sure. So, yep, you got it. You are being professional. I like those footy pajamas that you're wearing.
Shh, you weren't supposed to say that. I actually still have my mucks on. It was 19 below out this morning when I started it took me 3 tries to start the Suburban this morning. It wasn't very happy with me, but anyways, a little chilly here in February. But
I talked to a friend in northern Montana the other day, and he said 2 pieces of good news. He said, we don't have a mosquito problem today. And he says, as far as I know, no Californians have moved in the last 3 days. So I thought that was funny.
Yeah. You always have those memes. Why do I live where the air hurts my face? And then whatever else, whatever the next frame is. But I saw a new one yesterday. Why do I live where the air hurts my face? And it was a picture of a giant snake eating a giant bat. And I'm like, this is why I live where the air hurts my face.
Nice.
John Coleman Locke, we're thinking about you, buddy. Next up, what's next in your mind on the list of the grazing principles?
Well, so this one overlaps pretty well with stock density. Let's go to herd effect.
Okay.
And herd effect is it's a tool to be used sometimes to create change, and it overlaps very well with the stock density. And herd effect is the behavior of a large, excited herd of animals. And so it's the other things that high stock density can bring along with it, the hooves and the physical action on the ground, putting old plant material on the ground to jumpstart that decomposition. People often hear herd effect and they think, well, this is something I need to do on every acre of my ranch every year. And I don't agree. I think it's a tool to be used sometimes in some places that can move the successional processes. So maybe we've got a patch of ground that's stuck in some kind of a state, and maybe it's a less desirable state. Maybe it's a brushy state. Maybe it's in our area here we get these stands of blue grama and threadleaf sedge, which is a really low growing kind of a mat forming grass. And so if you get a rain timed right, you could put those animals in and stimulate some herd effect and really create an opportunity for that landscape to change to a more desirable state. So that's one of the principles to use.
Below the one dam on our place, there's some places where after it overflows, it's started to create some gullies, and they're probably 3 to 4 feet deep and probably a little that wide or a little wider, maybe 6 to 8 feet wide at this point. And so this summer when I had the custom grazing cattle all together in one mob, I just took the mineral tub and threw it down in the bottom of one of those gullies. So I had to walk down in there to get it. And there's already some places where that started to round off those sharp edges where that erosion has taken place, and just I'll probably just keep doing that year after year, and hopefully start to see some of that succession take place and some improvement in those areas.
Nice. Yeah, we've seen some different examples of people using it to, treat some weedy areas that they're wanting to jumpstart into be something else. To deal with some areas of bare ground, to start closing that in, and so yeah, there's a lot of good uses for it.
And I think we're up to the fifth one now. What is that fifth principle?
So it's related to graze period, and the principle is keep graze period short to improve animal performance. So as you think about this, I relate it to the feed truck effect, right? And so I spent some time working in a feedlot, and we fed animals twice a day. Mm. Some yards would feed animals 3 times a day, and on the weekend. And especially on Sundays, we were able to feed once a day. So why don't feedlots always feed once a day? Right? You could reduce your labor, reduce the number of times the truck's having to run. Right? Well, when the people that are familiar with feedlots are going to say, well, animal performance is going to go down. Right? So having that truck come by the bunk multiple times a day is going to stimulate intake for those animals. Right. And those people that do this grazing will know that when you go out there to move your wire or let them into a fresh pasture, the animals get up, and even if they're full, they're going to increase intake. So shortening the graze period will improve animal performance. Now there's an asterisk by this one. You have to manage the severity of the graze. I can't ask those animals to take it right on. If I was grazing some old, like let's do crested wheatgrass that's gone mature. I know you have quite a bit of that. So if you're grazing your crested wheatgrass and you say, man, I really want to beat this stuff back because I want to see something else come in there. So I'm going to do a severe grazing on this, and I'm going to do short graze periods, and I'm going to graze yearlings, and I want them to do 2 pounds a day. Not going to happen. Right. So short graze periods improve animal performance as long as, you've got decent quality feed and you're not doing a severe graze. You're balancing on that light to moderate graze.
It's a balance between the peak of nutritional quality in the paddock and then the crash if they stay too long. Is that kind of what's going on here?
Yeah, that's part of it. And so you can use this tool of short graze periods during some times a year when those animals need to be performing well. For the custom graze cattle that we take in here in Wheatland, I do a few spins around my low irrigated bottom ground here. And when those animals first arrive, they get here late May, 1st of June. We're turning bulls out for this customer about the 10th of June. And so that first part of the breeding season, from when those animals arrive through about the middle of July, we want to make sure they're on a really good plane of nutrition. right? So we're going to use short graze periods, and we're going to graze those plants light or light to moderate. And so we're spinning those animals through. At that point, the management really is focused on the animal. I'm sure I'm still trying to do a good job for my grasses, but I want to keep those animals gaining. I want to get them bred. Now, once we have those animals that pretty well bred up, and you can kind of tell when things slow down breeding wise, then we tend to slow down and we tend to work those plants a bit harder. If you want to pull a little condition off those cows at that later part of the summer, you can do that. But yeah, short grace periods are one tool to do that.
Is that light to moderate graze? Does that change depending on kind of the year and the moisture? Like say the classic example that I saw Dave Pratt give in a workshop one time in Belle Fourche, South Dakota, was he drew a really good year, with lots of grass up and down, and he said, take half, leave half. How much is half? And everybody agreed this was half, so he took that much. And then he drew a bad year or a less good year with less grass up and down. He said, take half, leave half. See, what we've done here is taken what would have been 7/8 of the grass last year. Now we're taking half. We're taking that much off of it this year because we don't have as much. So that light to moderate graze changes. Every year's different. Is that an accurate understanding?
Yeah, it's another one of these things where you just kind of look and guess. So when you're leaving that pasture, that paddock, as you look behind you and say, how am I doing? Did I graze this light, moderate, or heavy? And look at the grass, look at where you're leaving, look at the animals, how much fill do they have? What is the condition telling you performance is doing? You can look at the manure. And all those things. And I think you'll kind of you'll develop a feel for it, and you can say, well, hey, I'm happy with this, or boy, I really don't like what I'm seeing. Either I hit this pasture too hard, or, animal condition is telling me quality is not enough. So it's one of those, do it for a while and you'll start to get the feel for it.
Very good. Any other major nuggets or pieces on these grazing principles before we move on to some voicemails?
I think we covered them pretty well. That's the 5 grazing principles in a nutshell. And, in the school, of course, we go into application of these and what do they look like and spend some more time talking about them. But that's a nice little superficial touch on each of them.
Yep. Yeah. We're trying to give some people an appetizer. I always say when I'm talking in church, I always say, the purpose of being a Christian is to be like a sample at Sam's Club, to make people want more of that sample once they get a taste of it. And so that's what I'm hoping to do here, is to be a sample at Sam's Club for people of the Ranching for Profit School, and hopefully they'll want more after getting a taste of it. So,
who's the guy with the mustache, the Ron, whatever, something or other. Anyway, there's a video of him sampling the vegetarian bacon, and the person hands it to him and he just throws it right in the trash, and he'll say, "Oh yeah, I'd like another, please." Right. So that was the image that popped into my mind while you were telling them.
Yeah. So we're going to try this. And if you don't hear the voicemails playing on your end, just wave at me and we'll try something else. But I solicited some voicemails from the private Facebook group of the Working Cows podcast, the Working Cows Microbiome, which you can get access to at patreon.com/working cows. And so I've got this fancy new recording board here that I should be able to play it live, and you'll be able to hear it, and I'll be able to hear it, and we'll record it. And the first one comes from Adam Courtney, and he's gonna ask a question for us. So here we go.
Hi, Clay. Question for Dallas on grazing principles. Would you mind if he expounded on the differences between grazing grasses typically found in Missouri versus grasses in the northern plains, western South Dakota, and possibly if people in the northern plains with mostly cool season grasses should be attempting to graze through more than once, and what his thoughts are on that. Thanks.
So yeah, that's the question, I think.
Good. Yeah. I like it. It's a good question. As you start to practice this stuff, you sometimes scratch your head, right? And say, well, that worked there. Should it work here? How does it apply? And, I found in my application of this, there's even some species that you want to graze differently from other grass species. Preferably you've got a nice enormously diverse mix and you're managing diversity, but sometimes we're managing more monocultures. And for me, I've got tall wheatgrass in some of the pastures I've managed, and I find that stuff likes to be abused. It's kind of like crested, right? So it really likes a severe graze followed by a longer rest period rather than a light graze followed by a shorter rest period, because then it just puts up stems. So Adam's question is good, and I don't know that I'm going to have an answer for him that he really likes, because there's some rules of thumb that I've heard that I think have some pretty good application, and one of those rules is for every 10 inches of moisture you receive, you can count on one growing season graze. Okay, so here we're sitting at about a 15-inch precip. That means about a graze and a half during the growing season. Okay, so if I'm turning animals into pastures, and these are dry land, upland pastures, right? I'm not talking irrigated. So if I'm turning animals into pasture in May and maybe that first week of June, I could probably come back and hit those again in September, October time of year. They're probably going to have enough recovery to do that. If I'm grazing in a 6-inch precip zone, that one growing season graze is probably going to be about all I get. And I'm saying growing season because I think in most of these cases we can follow with at least one dormant season graze, if not maybe coming through in 2 passes during the dormant season. Okay. So you start to move into Missouri where, you're talking a 30-inch precip zone. And when I heard Jim Garish say this, and I think it's true, managing grass in Missouri is very much like managing grass under irrigation in Wyoming, in the high plains. Right. So that's when we're going to be talking about what I call working off the top end of the power curve. Right. So we're coming in and we're taking a light graze initially. We're really managing for regrowth. Right. We're grazing the grass up. Okay, so we're taking a light graze and it's coming back. The next time we come through, we might take a little more moderate graze, but we're still not wanting to set that plant back to where it takes a long time to recover. When you're managing grasses that only get 4 or 6 inches high, thinking, well, I'm just going to come and top that plant, right? Well, that's not how the animal eats. It's going to wrap its tongue around that Western wheatgrass and it's going to take the whole plant. Right. So being able to operate just on the top end of that power curve in those low precipitation environments just isn't really practical. Right. So again, it's about understanding the principles and about how the principles apply to your environment and trial and error. I mean, we're not going to have this stuff figured out by the time we're dead. So let's do the best we can.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. No. So I wonder. I like that. 1 pass per 10 inches of moisture. I wonder, is it kind of that first pass through, and then the second time through, are we only hitting half the acres, or the second time through, are we giving them twice as much access for the same number of days? How would you think about that, or are those both legitimate strategies?
I think they're legitimate strategies. I think the better strategy is to be very adaptable and to look at what you have in front of you that year and to make your adjustments based upon that. What maybe the animals you're grazing this year have a different nutritional requirement than the animals you were grazing last year. So they're going to need a different amount of space, right? Maybe the precip regime is going to be different. So what you're turning in on this year is going to be different from what you were turning in last year. So it's just going to be a matter of look what's in front of you, look at the animals you have, what their nutritional requirements are, and make some decisions and change and adapt. So I think that's probably something we didn't emphasize well enough in this conversation is, this is not about putting together a prescription to follow. This is about understanding some principles and then being very adaptable in how you apply these principles from year to year.
Yep. And then the last thing I'll say regarding Adam's question is I was sitting in Wally Olson's marketing school near Claremore, Oklahoma, which Wally would tell you is the easiest place in the world to raise a cow. But anyways, he we were talking, there was a discussion came up with some of those people that are farther east in Oklahoma and then in Missouri, and they were talking about endophyte infected tall fescue grass, and it'll make crazy things happen like tails and ears and feet fall off or whatever on these cows. And PJ Kimmel was sitting right in front of me, and I said, PJ, 12 inches of rain doesn't sound so bad anymore, does it? So there are some challenges that come along with those higher rainfall environments that we don't always think about.
Yeah.
Not to mention
sure
parasite load.
So, yeah. So I think maybe Claremore, Oklahoma should get a billboard of Wally Olson outside, right? And outside of the town, and he could have his face on there. Claremore, Oklahoma, the easiest place to ranch. Come here. He could be like as a Chamber of Commerce. So, and that's said with a smile on my face, Wally, my friend.
Yeah. I agree. Or they at least need to pay him some commission. So
there we go.
All right. Next voicemail here.
Hey, Clay, this is Jay Clark. Just saw the post about questions for Dallas. I hope this is in time. But I'd just like to see him explain some of the differences and beliefs behind non-selective and selective grazing in your rotational grazing systems. I think that's something that divides a lot of people in the regenerative ag movement, and kind of what he sees working well in some areas in different environments, and what he sees in others, and just kind of maybe spend a little bit of time addressing the non-selective versus the selective grazing.
All right, I think that's the end of the question there.
Got it. So I want to be really clear. The only way to make money in ranching is running black cows with 3-day graze periods and 35-day rest periods. Okay. And you have to calve in May, and you can't put up hay, right?
Yeah.
No, that's said in jest. Thanks for the question, Jay. I appreciate it. I'm probably not the right one to ask. And I probably don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about it, to be honest. I've been around very good grazers who feel very strongly that allowing the animals to select what they're eating and not do the non-selective grazing is the way to go. I've been around people who I think are very good grazers who are following the more non-selective approach of high, more severe grazing, right? And making those animals clean it up, who are having amazing results with the land. What I would really care to say on both those cases is your ranch meeting of your objectives? Is the reason you're ranching, is it being met? What's your profitability like, right? What are the goals you're trying to fulfill? And if both of them are meeting those goals in that case, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. And I don't spend any time worrying about the arguments between the two. I think they can both have great ecological benefits. I think the non-selective grazing can probably move drier climates faster, from what I've seen. This is just some of my, gut reactions to it. The challenge with the non-selective grazing can be getting good animal performance while doing that. Some of those places I've seen have sacrificed some animal performance to get the land improvements that they're seeing. So, and then all the different names for the different grazing programs. That's another thing I don't spend too much time worrying about. I mean, I think if you want to be a grazing consultant that's taken seriously, John Locke said you got to have a funny hat. So that's criteria number one. And then criteria number 2 is I think you got to come up with a name for your grazing program, right? So maybe I haven't figured both of those out yet, but that seems to be competing grazing consultant nomenclature. So I don't care to get into that fray.
No, that's good. I appreciate that. Are you socially, ecologically, and economically profitable? Let's start there. And then if you want to join a team, if you want to put on somebody else's jersey and go to bat, I guess more power to you, but let's get the first things first, right?
There we go. Like it.
Okay. Last one, last voicemail. And this one's a little bit harder to understand, just from a connection standpoint, but I think we'll be able to get it. And if not, I'll try to use Google Voice's, less than ideal, transcript of this call to fill in some gaps, but here we go.
Hi, this is Abe Jurgensen. I got a question for Dallas Mount about grazing practices. Well, it's more about, I got a question about soil sampling, and maybe he's not the one to answer. But anyway, I am wondering about soil sampling of pasture. It's in, I don't know, it's a 300-acre pasture. It's in 10 paddocks. And my question would be, is grid sampling worth the money, or how would you go about sampling it? If it was grid sampling, there's a lot of grid sampling in my area for fields. My question would be the cost. The cost, I think, is like $13 an acre to grid sample. I'm wondering about the knowledge. And then my other question would be about liming pastures. Is that worth it? Has it been done? Do a lot of people do it? Yeah, that was the main question.
So I think liming pastures, if I'm understanding right, but Abe Jurgensen can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But it'll be too late by the time he does. So that's okay, where we're at.
So two pieces. One was related to soil sampling. Yep. Is it worth the money? And he said do a good job of soil sampling and cost him $13 an acre is what I heard him say. Yep. And then the second was about liming pasture. Should he do that?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So I would defer to Nicole Masters on the soil sampling stuff. I really respect her a lot in the things that she's doing in the space, and from having been on a board, management board with the ranch with her, and the testing she's been doing on that and the results she's seeing and being able to track that, I think she thinks it's valuable, and I would defer to her on that. I'll tell you that on the places that I'm currently under my management, I have not been doing soil sampling, formal soil sampling. I do try to go outside and dig some holes every year and just look in there and see what the ground is telling me. And that's more from educating myself to more so than showing landowners, people that I'm leasing from or things like that. So I'm not doing it. So I'd be a hypocrite to tell you need to spend the money to do it. But I have seen some people that know more than I do that are really paying attention to this stuff, find that there's some real value in it. The thing I would struggle a little bit with, if you're managing extensive landscapes, so you're managing, a big piece of ground, what are you going to do with that information? I mean, are you going to put an amendment on that soil? Probably not. It's probably not going to make sense to do it. So your treatment's really going to come back to using animals to create that change for you. So in that kind of case, I think, just being observant is probably going to be your best tool. So on the liming thing, I always get a little nervous when people start talking about amendments to the soils and things like that, just because I see a lot of amendments that are done from a more of a farming perspective that when we look at it from a ranching perspective, don't make a lot of sense economically, right? We're going to spend a lot of money to maybe pick up that same money a few years in the future. So if that's the case, I don't really get excited about that. We look for things that provide a high amount of return on capital, invest a little money, get a lot of money back. And, if you can show me economically that liming or some of these amendments are going to make sense, then I can get behind them. But so many of these things I see are just marginal when it comes to economic benefit. So I'd encourage people to look for somewhere else to put the money.
Get the recovery period right, get the stocking rate matched to the carrying capacity, get the stock density as high as is practically possible, get the graze period matched to the recovery rate and the herd effect. And some of those things are going to start to take care of themselves. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate your time today.
I think we had our connection slowed down there a little bit. So, but I think we're back now. So okay. Sorry. Joys of technology.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and make voicemails a more regular part of podcasts going forward. So that's going to be opened up to our people who are supporters of the podcast will get a notification about that. So if you want to have an opportunity to have a voicemail played on the show and ask a question of a guest, go ahead and head over to patreon.com/workingcows, and we'll get you in on that. Dallas, anything else that you wanted to promote, talk about, share regarding grazing principles?
No, I think we covered it, Clay. Thanks for the opportunity to be on again. Appreciate talking with you.
Good stuff there. Be sure to check out the show notes page. As I said, workingcows.net/179. There will be links up there to the Ranching for Profit School. There will be links up there to the Fieldwork podcast, fieldworktalk.org. There's just a lot of good opportunities out there. Really look forward to next week's episode. We will be talking with Wayne Knight. He's heavily involved with Holistic Management International, and I look forward to a chat with him in the near future. So we'll see you real soon again with another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.